Hello wrestling fans. Thanks for tuning in again today. Mike Tyson vs. Evander Holyfield was definitely a work, in the opinion of this robot. Don't forget, you can click the join button below to become a Pro Wrestle Machine member where you can enjoy ad-free videos, member exclusives, access to the Discord and much more. But let's get into the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. July 7, 1997 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. WWF vs. WCW Battle of LA. Cornette to ECW. Tyson Holyfield, tons more. By Observer staff. After a few months of planning, the Battle of Los Angeles took place on the same night as the Tyson Holyfield rematch. The winner? One would have to call it shrouded in controversy. World Championship Wrestling, running June 28 at the Great Western Forum in Los Angeles, claimed a total attendance of 10,948, with a paid of $9,705 and a $189,940 gate, figures confirmed by the Forum box office, in a building that seats about 18,000. The WWF, citing Ticketron as its source, claimed that their information was that WCW did a crowd of 11,629 fans, but with only 7,699 paid and a gate of $158,716. Part of the dispute over the money figures and total paid attendance may be in regard to season ticket holders at the Forum. WCW made a deal with the building to get paid by the building a certain amount for each season ticket holder who attended the event, and thus in the Forum box office figures they would be considered paid attendance, which is a highly unusual deal at arenas of this type in that usually season ticket holders aren't figured into the paid attendance, nor do the event promoters receive money from their attendance, although from a mathematical standpoint, that wouldn't add up the numbers correctly either to explain a discrepancy between the two figures. There were also, according to Forum figures, 780 ticket holders, virtually all comp ticket holders, that had tickets but didn't attend the show, which would explain part of the reason the Ticketron figures listed a higher actual attendance than the Forum figures, although as you can see, those numbers don't add up perfectly, throwing that in either. The figures are by far its best showing from a gate perspective ever in Southern California, a market that neither WCW nor its predecessor, Jim Crockett Promotions, were ever able to sustain consistent business in, although have been a few solid crowds in the past. Crockett's debut show in the market in the mid-80s in the same building drew about 8,500 fans, and that was with a company that didn't have a microscopic fraction of the promotional ability or promotional budget of today's WCW, and theoretically wasn't nearly as over on a national basis, although live wrestling attendance overall nationally was stronger in those days. However, the history since then has been spotty, with the last paid show in the market being a 1994 Hulk Hogan vs. Ric Flair main event in Anaheim, which drew less than 3,000 paid and $40,000, and a free 1995 pay-per-view show at Huntington Beach which drew approximately 9,500. However, given the intense marketing push and loaded show, the numbers have to be a disappointment, particularly since there was virtually no walk-up with lots of last-week promotion aimed at the Hispanic community, and one would question how profitable the show was given the huge advertising budget, costs for all the production special effects given the Saturday Nitro theme, the live appearance of Hulk Hogan, and the fact the Forum is among the most costly buildings in the country to run. Throwing in the merchandise figure of $82,000 would be the only way to make the difference between profitability and rating for the show as a whole. Although WCW has the more depth and thus had the stronger undercard, the WWF was able to counter, even with all the injuries and what seemed like weekly lineup changes, with a main event that put its three biggest stars in the ring against each other with the world title at stake. WCW instead had to push its biggest stars, Hulk Hogan and Sting, as appearing in a face-off, which sounds more like a debate than a match, since Hogan opted not to wrestle on the show, wanting to save the first Sting match for pay-per-view later in the year. Since WCW has been able to pack crowds most Mondays promising nothing but personal appearances and advertising no matches, in most markets that would have been enough. New York and Los Angeles are both different from most markets in that in both cases, the WWF is the decided home team because of history, and that people who live in those cities expect only the very best from an entertainment standpoint, not just in wrestling but across the board entertainment-wise, since they are the media capitals and something perceived as anything but the best product possible isn't going to pack the building. The World Wrestling Federation, which runs the market regularly and has dominated Southern California live wrestling business since the early 80s with the exception of a brief period where AAA was doing off-the-chart numbers, ran the same night at the Arrowhead Pond in Anaheim drawing 9,469 fans, of which 8,449 were paid with a $150,447 gate in a building that seats a little less than 16,000. The WWF also did $72,000 in merchandise business at the show. Those figures have to be considered successful even though the dollar figures are lower than the WCW figures. It was going against the biggest money boxing match in history and with a rival show in the same basic market, in some ways Anaheim and Los Angeles, although within driving distance of one another, are also different markets, and still drew, with the exception of the 1996 WrestleMania, the largest paid attendance and gate for a WWF show in the market in more than 2 years, although it also was given a far bigger promotional push than a typical house show. WCW considered it a victory because it drew the larger crowd and gross. WWF considered it a victory claiming their show was the more profitable because less money was spent on advertising, which is also the case since WCW spent slightly more than $100,000 just on advertising alone for the show. Both sides pushed the show heavily with lots of public appearances. The WWF's final promotional stop was a public workout by Ken Shamrock, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Chyna and Sonny at Venice Beach, about a 90-minute drive from Anaheim, the afternoon of the show. Kevin Nash, Scott Hall and Six came to Venice Beach to hang out with Helmsley and were there as well. The WCW show, billed in some circles as the show Eric Bischoff doesn't want you to see, was described as a good but not great show with a very strong undercard and weak work in the main matches, similar to the typical WCW pattern. It was a heavy heel crowd, with the only main event faces to get major cheers being Roddy Piper and Sting, and described as being 25 to 30% Mexican. There has been a lot of controversy about WCW being unable to draw Mexican fans in markets like San Jose and Los Angeles that these same former AAA wrestlers drew on their own years back, but that is going to be the case because those wrestlers have no Spanish-language television as opposed to about 7 hours per week when AAA was doing over $200,000 per show over a 2-year period. In addition, when promoting to ethnics, the ethnic stars in order for the promotions to be successful have to be the headliners, and in WCW's case the former AAA superstars are generally prelim wrestlers, which gives the former AAA fans no great incentive to follow them in WCW. This has probably greatly hurt their drawing potential for the future in the US, even if WCW follows through on its plan to develop a WCW Latino television show to focus on Mexican wrestling and develop anywhere from quarterly to monthly lucha libre style pay-per-view shows for the US to hit the growing Spanish language market. WCW geared much of its advertising over the last week to the Spanish language market and pushed the 6-man tag team match, which turned out to be the opening match on the card, as the main event in the advertising and also focused on Rey Mysterio Jr. and Eddie Guerrero, and downplayed Hogan, Sting and the rest, and the result was no walk-up at all. The show opened with them introducing all the announcers, with Lee Marshall, a longtime Los Angeles DJ, being booed heavily. The other announcers all received smatterings of boos with the exception of Bobby Heenan, who was cheered wildly by this largely heel crowd. 1. Juventud Guerrera and Lizmark Jr. and Damien beat Conan and La Parca and Villano 4 in 10:18 when Guerrera pinned Villano turning a powerbomb into a Hurricane Rana. This was said to have been a great fast-paced match, with Guerrera doing a Liger dive over the head of announcer Mike Tenay at ringside. Guerrera slipped on the planned finish, some sort of a springboard move, likely that somersault into a dropkick, but Villano did a great job of covering his mistake. 3.5 stars. 2. Ultimo Dragon pinned Psicosis in 12:28 after a spinning Hurricane Rana off the top rope and a tap out to a Dragon sleeper submission. Dragon was said to have been really over with the crowd. Psicosis did a running springboard into a moonsault block off the top rope to the floor as the highlight. 3.5 stars. 3. Eddie Guerrero pinned Dean Malenko in 16:31 with his feet on the ropes. Guerrero was mainly doing the Art Bar heel routine and was tremendous in his new role. This was largely considered the best match on the show and from reports from the previous night in Fresno, totally stole the show there as well. 3.75 stars. 4. Steiners beat Marcus Bagwell and Masahiro Chono in 16:20. Most of the entertainment was provided by Bagwell's antics. Rick pinned Bagwell with a belly-to-belly suplex while Chono's back was turned and he was fighting with Scott outside the ring. After the match, Bagwell tried to explain to Chono that he was the one who had pinned Rick and that they had won the match. 1.75 stars. Before the next match, Gene Okerlund did a live interview with Ric Flair. Flair was out there to turn himself heel for the match with Roddy Piper. Flair got a huge babyface reaction coming out, but then started insulting the fans, the Lakers and the women in Los Angeles with the typical old-style Flair heel promo. Even when it was over, he still got at best 50% of the fans turned against him. 5. The next match was scheduled as a cruiserweight title match with Six defending against Rey Mysterio Jr. Before the match, Chris Jericho came out and challenged the winner to defend the title against him later in the card. Jericho wasn't over a lick. Mysterio Jr. accepted, and then Six, to a huge face pop, said something to the effect of "Nobody in this building even gives a rat's ass about you," and talked about having beaten him before on television, which was true since they largely didn't. The two had a good match, although not as good as some of their previous bouts, ending in 11:33 with the Buzzkiller submission. Highlight was Mysterio Jr. doing the Liger flip dive springboarding off the back of the referee, and Six doing the Michinoku driver 2 on Mysterio Jr. for a near fall. 3 stars. 6. Jericho was challenged to get in the ring, and he came in, hit a leg lariat and pinned Six in 32 to capture the cruiserweight title. Jericho was booed out of the building for winning. The entire NWO, including Hogan, came out for an interview to a total face reaction. The crowd totally cheered Hogan. Hogan challenged Sting to come out then and there, but nothing materialized. 7. Roddy Piper beat Ric Flair with a sleeper in 8-10. Match didn't have much heat, but when Flair's arm went down the third time there was a big pop. The only other big pop was Piper pulling Flair's trunks down. Told it was watchable live, but it would be a bad match if it were on a pay-per-view. Since much of the crowd had already learned of the Tyson result, Piper started biting Flair's ear to try and get heat. 1 1/2 star. 8. Diamond Dallas Page pinned Randy Savage in 5:16 after 2 diamond cutters. Big early pop, but told the match was a major disappointment as they appeared to both be phoning in the performance. 1/2 star. 9. Lex Luger and the Giant beat Kevin Nash and Scott Hall via DQ in 12:01 in a WCW Tag Team title match. Unlike Flair, who tried to get the crowd not to cheer him, Hall and Nash were doing everything to encourage the crowd to cheer for them. There were lots of chants of Diesel and Razor, which is something that hadn't been heard at arenas for months. Typical not good match, with these 4 ending with Luger having Hall in the rack in the ring and Giant fighting Nash outside the ring. Hogan did a run-in and hit Luger with a pathetic shot with the title belt for the DQ. 1 1/4 stars. The NWO beat on Luger and Giant until Sting came down from the ceiling for the save. Sting ended up putting Hogan in the Scorpion Deathlock, with Hogan tapping out to make sure everyone registered until Six broke it up by hitting Sting with a lead pipe. Sting ended up getting the pipe from Six and, along with Luger and Giant, cleaned house momentarily. At this point Hogan went back to the dressing room. Hall, Nash and Six ended up going back to the ring. Sting gave Hall the Scorpion Death Drop, slop drop. Luger racked Nash and Giant choke slam Six. While the other two continued to sell, Nash got up and went after Sting, but Sting destroyed him with a baseball bat shot. The faces left while the heels sold in the ring for a very long time, until they finally got up and said that everyone knows Los Angeles is NWO country. Even though Hall, Nash and Six were the faces for the most part, the fans pelted the ring with garbage at the end. Seemingly this has become the thing to do because people copy what they see on television. Nash actually caught a cup and drank from it, which, considering what they sometimes put in the cups they throw in Los Angeles, isn't necessarily the wisest idea. We don't have as much detail on the Anaheim show. 1. Rockabilly pinned Flash Funk with a DDT off the ropes. Funk got a bloody nose in the match. 2. Farouk and Kama beat the Blackjacks when Kama pinned Wyndham. 3. Ken Shamrock, who got the biggest pop on the show except for Austin and Undertaker, beat Jim Neidhart. 4. The tanning contest went a too long 22 minutes. It turned into a strip show atmosphere with fans throwing money, which Sonny was only glad to collect. Similar to the Slammies, Sable wore the least and got the biggest pop to win. After it was over, Honky Tonk Man began insulting what Chyna was wearing and she body slammed him. 5. A triple threat match billed as to determine the number 1 contenders for the tag team title saw Owen Hart and Davey Boy Smith win over Godwins and Legion of Doom when Hart pinned Phineas in what was described as a bad match. 6. Vader pinned Goldust due to distraction from the Hart Foundation. 7. Mankind beat Hunter Hearst Helmsley via DQ due to interference from Chyna. After the match, Mankind put the mandible claw on Chyna to a big pop. 8. Undertaker retained the WWF title in the triple threat match over Bret Hart and Steve Austin. Bret was said to be about 50% of his usual effectiveness as he's not fully recovered from knee surgery. Said to have been the best match on the show, ending when Undertaker pinned Bret with a choke slam. After the match, Paul Bearer came out and talked about revealing the surprise on Monday and Undertaker knocked him out of the ring. Jim Cornette debuted with ECW on June 28 in Philadelphia in an angle very similar to the one a few weeks back with Jerry Lawler. In this case, during the main event with Sabu and Rob Van Dam versus Tommy Dreamer and Sandman, the lights went out in the middle of the match, and when they came back on, Lawler was in the ring and they worked over Dreamer and Sandman. This time Dreamer and Sandman made a comeback and the lights went out again, and when they came back on, Cornette was in the ring and laid out both Dreamer and Sandman and about half the dressing room with his tennis racket. During the finish, there were 2 referees knocked out, and then Todd Gordon came in to referee and he ended up being hit with a chair by Van Dam and sent through a table by Sabu, and the match ended with Sabu pinning Dreamer and Van Dam pinning Sandman simultaneously. Cornette's appearance was said to have gotten an even bigger response than the debut of Lawler at the previous show, and the angle was said to have come across every bit as strong. During the angle, Lawler caned Dreamer low and Dreamer was legitimately injured to the point he couldn't work the next day and wasn't going to be anywhere near 100% for his match in Tokyo for War on Sunday. Much of the dressing room emptied and got their clocks cleaned. The angle ended similar to the first Lawler angle, with Taz music playing and him walking to the ring and the heels all leaving. Taz then spotted a fan wearing a WWF Raw is War t-shirt and asked for the shirt. The fan wouldn't give it to him, which started what could have been a bad scene as the crowd was looking to jump on the guy. Taz said if he didn't give him the shirt that the fans in the building were going to beat him up and get the shirt anyway. The guy still didn't give him the shirt, and Taz finally said that he respected the fan for standing up for himself, at which point the fan gave him the shirt and Taz burned the WWF t-shirt in the ring to end the show. Cornette debuting ended about a week's worth of negotiations, largely with Chris Condito as the middleman between Paul Heyman and Cornette. Heyman wanted to bring Cornette into the arena, feeling he was the last person anyone would expect to do an angle with ECW. Cornette, who has a long-standing hatred of both Heyman and ECW but also had been in a position to do the kind of angles that he loves for a long time, originally laughed off the suggestion but did it since Heyman met a number of his stipulations. The main stipulation would be that Heyman would apologize to Cornette's friend and longtime rival promoter Dennis Coralluzzo about the incident where Coralluzzo was double-crossed regarding the NWA title tournament a few years back when ECW hosted the tournament in late 1994, then had Shane Douglas throw down the belt and actually used the tournament to create Douglas as the first ECW World Champion instead. Both sides agreed to bury the hatchet in their long-standing war in that Coralluzzo wouldn't try to cost ECW dates, and ECW would allow Coralluzzo to use ECW talent when there isn't a conflicting date, without putting heat on the boys for working Coralluzzo's show. Cornette would also be in control of the angle that would be done. Heyman sent a limo to pick up both Coralluzzo and Cornette and bring them to the arena and apologize to Coralluzzo, and Coralluzzo started to apologize back when Heyman said that both would start with a clean slate. Exactly where this angle is going is hardly clear, although Cornette is expected to manage Lawler on July 11 in Asbury Park, New Jersey, and perhaps on the other dates Lawler will work in ECW. Lawler only has a few dates booked with ECW: the Asbury Park show, the July 19 show at the ECW Arena, and the August 17 pay-per-view show. Cornette is expected to be cutting at least one interview to build up his future appearances, although nothing is 100%. Supposedly Cornette also wanted Heyman to apologize to Coralluzzo in front of the boys and let the boys know they could work for Coralluzzo, and it was sort of agreed that would take place sometime in the future. Cornette was only in the dressing room for a short period of time before doing the angle, while Coralluzzo never left the limo. The finish of the Tyson Holyfield match brings us back to pro wrestling history, its own battle of the bite that actually threw the World Heavyweight title into turmoil and in a few ways changed certain aspects of the future of the wrestling industry. The year was 1931. Pro wrestling by this time had long become a complete work, however the World Heavyweight title still had considerable prestige and drawing power. During the 1920s there were now legendary stories of double crosses and attempted and even successful thefts by promoters and/or wrestlers of the title, which was why in those days, and this largely continued even in the days of the National Wrestling Alliance through the 1970s, that generally the holder of the world title, and there were exceptions, were guys that had the reputation of being tough enough to handle a bad situation. The story actually started about 2 years earlier, when Gus Sonnenberg, a college football superstar, this was in the days when college football was far more popular than pro football, was recruited into wrestling by New England promoter Paul Bowser, and due to his name and popularity, became the biggest drawing card in the country. Ed Strangler Lewis, the perennial world champion and arguably best actual wrestler of that era, dropped his title to Sonnenberg to set up lucrative rematches around the country that did big business despite the U.S. economy being in the midst of its biggest depression ever. While Sonnenberg was a great draw in the ring, his reign was filled with the problems of having a guy who didn't know how to wrestle carry the world title in a wildcatting era. Bowser and Lewis were able to protect Sonnenberg in the ring so he never had to deal with anyone who would double-cross him, but rival promoters constantly had their tough wrestlers challenge him, which he had to continually ignore, use wrestlers in states where wrestling was deregulated and give them the Gus Sonnenberg name and have them job. Then, in the biggest coup of all, Jim Londos, who was Sonnenberg's rival at that time as far as being pro wrestling's biggest drawing card and frozen out of the world title picture since Bowser would never let him near Sonnenberg, arranged for his friend, a small but tough middleweight wrestler, to mug Sonnenberg on a crowded Los Angeles street corner. Sonnenberg's inability to wrestle didn't hurt the credibility of the world title, but his getting beaten up on a street corner in front of numerous witnesses by a little man was a disaster, and Bowser immediately recognized he had to get the title off Sonnenberg immediately for business, and to a real tough wrestler to avoid all the problems the Sonnenberg reign had. He put the strap on Ed Don George, who had just turned pro after placing fourth in the 1928 Olympic Games, but this was done without consulting either Lewis or his longtime associate and behind-the-scenes promoter, Billy Sandow, who had been in control of the world title for most of the previous decade. Lewis then played his own game, working for Bowser and acting as if it was just business and doing frequent jobs to get his confidence and make him feel putting him in a title match, which would draw, would be business as usual. However, when the match took place on April 14, 1931 in Los Angeles, Lewis during the introductions told George that he was taking the title back that night and told George they could shoot for it, or work a great match. Since George knew he couldn't beat Lewis, he told Lewis that they should give the fans a great match, and put Lewis over in the end, double-crossing Bowser, and briefly regaining control of pro wrestling's most important title, which led to the Battle of the Bite. Bowser booked Lewis with 1924 Olympic gold medalist Henri Deglaine just 3 weeks later, on May 4 in Montreal. Lewis went into the ring told by Bowser it was simply business as usual, thinking he was going to retain his title. In those days, world title matches were generally 2 of 3 falls and the wrestlers would go back to the dressing room between falls for lengthy rest periods. After working 2 falls, Deglaine bit himself in the arm hard, until he drew blood. They cleaned the blood up and got in the ring and locked up. Deglaine squeezed the cut, started screaming, probably similar to what Holyfield did. The ref saw the teeth marks and blood all over Deglaine, and disqualified Lewis and gave Deglaine, who was the local wrestling hero at the time, the world heavyweight title. That wasn't the end of the story. When Lewis went back to the dressing room to confront Bowser about the double cross, Bowser had several bodyguards armed with baseball bats. The historical significance is that due to this match, and several others over the next few years, it became policy in both American and Canadian pro wrestling for championships not to change hands on a disqualification. In Mexico, Japan, and the rest of the world, without a situation like this in their history, titles have always changed hands via DQ except in the case of an American championship being defended in Japan, in which case the fans understand American title match rules are used. Screw job finishes were around long before 1931, but this gave bookers for the next 7 decades the easiest title match finish of all. The champion gets DQ'd so the challenger doesn't have to do a job. At one point this became a convenient way to set up logical rematches and create longer title programs, but by the 80s, it was simply an easy out for bookers to put together finishes without having to get anyone to do a job, and everyone could leave happy. Well, except for the fans. Overuse of these finishes killed several lucrative wrestling markets in the Southeast temporarily in the late 80s. One last comment as it regards Tyson Holyfield. Of course boxing will survive, and of course Tyson will eventually return to the ring and draw huge money in the process. Those who are predicting the death of big money boxing on pay-per-view or of Tyson's drawing power should look at pro wrestling. There have been absolute disasters on pay-per-view, pathetic performances and awful shows, and they sometimes hurt the business and sometimes don't, but in the long run, the business is much bigger and stronger than any one incident. However, this was the most watched pay-per-view event in history with the highest price tag ever and a totally unsatisfactory conclusion. And I wonder if anyone will confront those boxing supporters who have successfully gotten NHB, and more indirectly ECW, off numerous cable systems and explain the double standard now? And even though pro boxing and pro wrestling don't have a huge crossover audience, this isn't a week that I'd want to be promoting a pay-per-view event. Japanese television rundown. June 15, All Japan. 1. Kobashi and Ace and Patriot beat Williams and Albright and Lacrosse in 22 minutes. The last 13 minutes aired on television. Some was good and some wasn't, basically equaling out to a slightly better than average match. The biggest pops were for Albright's suplexes. Ace was the focal point of the match and looked good in the finishing sequence but looked so-so most of the way selling. They did a combination ace crusher and double powerbomb in triple teaming Williams, but he ended up being saved from a pin. There was a big pop for Ace's pin on Williams 1 minute later using the Cobra suplex. 2 1/4 stars. 2. Akiyama and Omori retained the All-Asian Tag Team titles, beating Honda and Inoue in 17-11. The last 9:30 aired. Honda was in most of the way and looked good. There's something about the way he looks with the big face, straggly hair and unimpressive physique that isn't of star quality, but he did well with Akiyama. Then again, who couldn't? Lots of near falls by Honda on Akiyama with the crowd wanting to see the upset. But Akiyama hit the exploder suplex almost out of nowhere to score the pin. 3 1/4 stars. June 21st, New Japan. 1. Nakanishi and Kojima retained the IWGP Tag titles, beating NWO Sting and Chono in 14-15. The last 9 minutes aired on television. The pacing was good but the match wasn't good early. Nakanishi and Kojima did a spot where they nearly broke up and started shoving to tease a possible title change. Sting used a power bomb and Chono used the STF on Kojima. Kojima caught a Yakuza kick and lariated Chono. Bout picked up at the 10 minutes mark and turned into a good match with a lot of near falls before Sting was caught with a sandwich lariat and then another lariat by Kojima for the pin. 2 3/4 stars. 2. Kimura and Ishikawa beat Choshu and Kido in 10:55 when Kimura pinned Kido after 3-leg lariats. The second half aired. Fans hated Ishikawa even being there since he heads a smaller promotion. It was decent. 2 stars. 3. Hashimoto pinned Muto in 26:01 to retain the IWGP Heavyweight title. They aired 13:30 on television. It turned into a very good match, but impaled by comparison to the Kota Misawa match the next night that no doubt they went 26 minutes in order to compete with. You'd expect more from these two in this situation, as it was like they were out there knowing what they needed to do to have a very good match but did nothing more than that to attempt to make it a great or memorable match. Muto did his trademark spots and Hashimoto threw a few brutal kicks, but it was almost as if Muto was knowing he had to take them because it was a title match but wasn't about to take as many as others have taken from Hashimoto to put on the classic dramatic match. Muto used the dragon screw and to set up the figure 4 a few times, but Hashimoto got to the ropes. The new spots were when Hashimoto went for a brainbuster early. At the top, Muto kicked him in the head. Later, as Muto went for a figure 4, Hashimoto kicked him in the head. Hashimoto finally hit the brainbuster and got the pin. The big story was after the match. The NWO came out to console him about losing, but he walked out on them. But then, as he was being interviewed, he left the interview area and went into the NWO dressing room. 3 1/2 stars. EMLL Paco Alonso had a meeting with most of his top wrestlers on June 26, telling them that he's got 15 contracts that he's in charge of filling with WCW, which repeated what he's already said in the press. This has caused further heat with the promo AZTECA wrestlers, with the feeling that they worked hard with no contracts or guarantees to get American fans into a foreign product, and now they're being shoved aside from a rival promotion. At the meeting, Alonso claimed that Conan would be working for him when it comes to the power in the US, and that he'd be the main decision maker. Eric Bischoff still hasn't gone to Mexico, though again that is supposed to take place shortly, at which time some sort of a deal is expected to be finalized. One would suspect, given what has been successful both for WCW and in Japan, that Bischoff would try and work the EMLL crew against the AZTECA crew as the top feud for pay-per-view. Although the When Worlds Collide show was marginally successful, at about the same level as the first ECW show, the popularity and exposure levels of Lucha Libre in the United States are way down, so a Lucha Libre pay-per-view show today wouldn't do anywhere close to as good business, particularly when so many of the top stars have been badly hurt in the US marketplace by their jobber roles. A meeting where Apollo Dantes, El Satanico, Black Warrior, La Fiera, Lizmark, Rey Bucanero Violencia, El Hijo del Santo, Negro Casas, Mr. Niebla Emilio Charles Jr., and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. Warrior, Bucanero and Niebla are all young and good workers and would, with experience in learning the new style, eventually do well in the US. Santo, Charles and Casas are all very good workers, but since they're older, they'll have more trouble adapting to a new style, and since their name gets them over and they aren't as spectacular as the guys people have seen, they'll have a harder time breaking out of the pack. Guys like Fiera, Lizmark and Rayo are too far past their prime to even be brought in. Alonso has hired an acting coach for his wrestlers to teach them how to better play the camera. Since television hasn't been an important part of Mexican wrestling until the past few years, most of the wrestlers as compared with American wrestlers are totally inexperienced in as far to playing to the camera but far better versed at playing to a live crowd, which is why generally a live Mexican show is much better than a live American show. But that doesn't hold up for television. Because the ZEC satellite was down over the weekend, the only thing we know about the June 27th Arena Mexico show was that it drew 3,000 fans with an elimination match on top with Felino and Negro Casas and Fiera and Ultimo Dragon over Santo and Dr. Wagner Jr. and Black Warrior and Bestia Salvaje. It came down to Felino and Santo as the final two and Felino used the figure 4 and got the submission. Santo and Felino had each ripped apart the other's mask during the match. Santo issued a challenge for the mask match which likely won't be held until September. In the semifinal, Dantes and Headhunters beat Taka Michinoku and Shocker and El Texano. On June 29 at Arena Coliseo, Michinoku was scheduled to defend what was billed as the FMW World Middleweight title against Satanico. The belt he was defending was the Japanese Independent Junior Heavyweight belt. Promo AZTECA. Pierre Roth Jr. in his first interview since jumping claimed that he had a surprise from Conan and that he would finally win the Mask of Mascara Sagrada. In the main event on June 20th in Cuernavaca, Conan and Hector Garza, who didn't look good here either, and Sagrada beat Dandy and Blue Panther and CN Caras. Dandy and Panther argued after the match which led to Pierre Roth and Silver King hitting the ring and they all attacked Panther. CN Caras finally helped Panther, but he was outmanned until Psicosis and Juventud Guerrera saved him. All the faces ended up in the ring and it was one of those three-way team brawls. The June 27th taping in Cuautitlan was headlined by Vampiro and Garza and Sagrada vs. Los Hermanos Dinamita and Lizmark Jr. and Pantera and Gitano vs. Los Villanos. The Rey Mysterio Jr. knee injury that will keep him out of action 6 weeks to 2 months will be explained in Mexico in an angle on July 4th, where he'll be injured by Psicosis to build up their planned mask vs. mask match later in the year. The June 29th Tijuana show was moved to Mexicali where it drew about 4,000 fans because of the suspension of Conan from wrestling in Tijuana and the suspension of promoter Benjamin Mora from promoting there. AAA. Really don't have much from here as well due to the satellite transmission being down. Top Win Promotions, using a lot of AAA wrestlers, had a show on June 29th at El Toreo in Naucalpan, the same building that AAA drew its biggest crowd of the year in 2 weeks earlier, headlined by a triangular mask match with Mil Mascaras, Tinieblas Sr. and Gran Marcus Jr. One would expect that Marcus lost the match since the other two are two of the most famous masks in the history of Mexico. All Japan. The top two matches for the July 25th Budokan Hall show will be Mitsuharu Misawa vs. Akira Tao for the Triple Crown and Kenta Kobashi and Johnny Ace defending the tag team titles against Steve Williams and Gary Albright. New tour started on June 28th in Utsunomiya. It was announced that Patriot wouldn't return to Japan until December due to a torn tricep, although he worked a dark match at Raw on June 30th starting his tour with WWF. Williams and Albright beat Giant Kimala 2 and Tama and Honda on opening night to get themselves over as the new contending tag team, while the next night at Korakuen Hall saw an upset result as Misawa and Jun Akiyama lost to Tao and Honda when Honda pinned Akiyama, which may be the first, or among the first times that has happened. June 22nd TV show did a 3.9 rating. New Japan. Top 3 matches announced for August 10th at the Nagoya Dome are Riki Choshu vs. Tatsumi Fujinami, which will almost surely be their final singles match, Shinya Hashimoto vs. Masahiro Chono for the IWGP Heavyweight title, and Great Muta vs. Naoya Ogawa. It is now almost a lock that the main event for the January 4, 1988 Tokyo Dome show will be Choshu's final match with Kensuke Sasaki, his protege, as his opponent. Choshu has never lost to Sasaki. He was actually supposed to during the G1 tournament in 1996, but due to an injury by Junji Hirata on the first night screwing up the original plans, they mathematically couldn't pull off the desired result of Choshu getting to the final and also losing to Sasaki, so Choshu had to win that match. Dean Malenko and probably Michael Wallstreet arrive in New Japan later this week. Chono left Japan after the June 25th show for a brief WCW tour, but will return here for the big show on July 6th in Sapporo, and then return to WCW after that. On June 25th in Kanazawa after the main event where Muta and Chono and NWO Sting beat Sasaki and Hirata and Hashimoto, Sasaki ripped up an NWO t-shirt which he took off a photographer.
Chono then threw the photographer into the ring and spray-painted NWO on his back. Sasaki and his wife, Akira Hokuto, were both asked to join the NWO but turned it down. Michiyoshi Ohara will get the final slot in the G1 tournament, opened up with the injury to Shiro Koshinaka. June 21st TV show drew a 3.1 rating.
Other Japan notes. Saw the tape of the June 21st Rings show from Tokyo Ariake Coliseum. The only matches that looked like shoots were the two Vale Tudo rules bouts. Mitsuya Nagai vs Andre Manard only went 20 seconds, so it may have been, and there were reactions that made it look like it was, but I'm skeptical. In the shoot matches, Ricardo Moraes 6-8 272 Brazilian, went to a 20-minute draw with Yuri Korkikhin of Russia. Moraes totally dominated the match and beat up Korkikhin, whose face ended up all bloodied and bruised by the end of the fight, but never really came close to putting him away. My feeling watching Moraes in this match is he'd be no match for the likes of a Mark Kerr or a Mark Coleman, as he really didn't show a lot of skill, and he'd be a sitting duck for their strong takedowns. Also, shoot matches in a ring are different from in an octagon, as Korkikhin just hung onto the ropes the entire match and did nothing on offense and survived far easier than he would have had the match been in an octagon. Agilson Lima vs Alexander Fedorov was the other shoot. The story behind this is Fedorov was the submission coach for both Ilukine Mikhail and Yoshihisa Yamamoto, both of whom lost to Gracie fighters last year, and it was the Russian/Japanese deal where the sensei of the stable has to go for revenge. Fedorov was purported to be a Russian Karl Gotch, but he's now 51. Actually, for the first minute or so he looked good but couldn't hook a leg lock on, but due to his age, by the 90 seconds mark, he was pretty well gone. Lima dominated him from the top until the towel was thrown in at 10:30. Yamamoto vs Maurice Smith looked to be a worked match, as Smith never threw a dangerous punch or tried a leg kick, so you can't read anything into the Coleman match by using this match. In the television announcing, they said that neither Yamamoto nor Smith liked the rules, but that Maeda had Smith wearing 10-ounce gloves without fingers free in order to protect the reputation of both fighters. The fact the shoot matches were put in the middle of the show instead of as the main event seemed to be based on the unpredictability of shoot matches, and thus they put Kiyoshi Tamura, their best worker, on top, so fans would go home with a great performance. It may also symbolize that interest in real shooting has passed its peak in Japan. Next Rings show is July 22nd in Osaka with Akira Maeda vs Hans Niemann, Kiyoshi Tamura vs Bitsade Terriel, and Yoshihisa Yamamoto vs Mitsuya Nagai as the top three matches. Pancrase ran on June 30th at Hakata Star Lanes before a sellout 2,800 with Yuki Kondo winning a judge's decision over Semishield after going the 20 minutes. In the other top matches, Masakatsu Funaki beat Wesley Gasaway, who has plenty of NHB experience in the US, with an ankle lock in 105. Boss Rutan made Takakufuku submit to an armlock in 428, and Guy Mesger scored a 2-0 lost points decision, beating Keiichiro Yamamiya in his first match since winning the UFC tournament. The next Pancrase will be an afternoon and evening combination show at Korakuen Hall on July 20th, which will feature the annual Neo Blood for undercard wrestlers tournament, which will consist of Satoshi Hasegawa, David Moore, Kuizumi Noah debuting, Alex Andrade, Yukio Kubota debuting, Haro Terzian, Yamamiya, and Leigh Johnston, Australia. Non-tournament matches on the show include Mesger vs Rutan, Funaki vs Asami Shibuya, Kondo vs Jason Godzi, and Minoru Suzuki vs Jason DeLucia, with the Suzuki DeLucia winner getting the next shot at Kondo's COP title. They are doing an angle with Suzuki and Kondo, with Kondo complaining about Suzuki badmouthing him as champion, and the fact that even though he was the champion, that Suzuki's return was made the main event on the May 24th show instead of his match. Some details on a Hickson Gracie vs Nobuhiko Takada deal, which has all but fallen apart. The promotions, a Nagoya-based company called H20, went to Nippon TV and asked $500,000 to $600,000 in sponsorship to cover some of the costs. The network turned it down, and they even dropped their asking price to $250,000, but the network turned that down because the feeling was the chances of customer satisfaction with the show wouldn't be good, because it would either be a one-minute match or a long, boring defensive struggle. In addition, K1 promoter Kazuyoshi Ishii, the leading kickboxing promoter in the world, had some sort of involvement because he's trying to become the Don King of Japan and expand into new shoot sports, and with his ties to Fuji Network, Nippon TV didn't want an involvement. Reportedly, Gracie received a $300,000 advance just for signing the contract, so he already has that part of his purse whether a match ever takes place or not. WAR announced the complete lineup for its July 6th show at Tokyo Sumo Hall.
Already announced was Genichiro Tenryu vs Tarzan Goto main event, in which the stipulation was added that if Tenryu wins, then Goto has to be his second in future matches, and if Goto wins, that War President Takei has to become Goto's second. A match to determine the vacant War 6-man belts with Koki Kitahara and Nobutaka Araya and Lance Storm vs Tommy Dreamer and Koji Kao and Nobukazu Hirai, Yuji Yasuoka defending the international junior title against Masao Orihara, Yoshiaki Fujiwara vs Abdullah the Butcher and Rumi Kazama, and Michiko Omukai vs Eagle Sawai and Soryo Kino in an LLPW women's match.
Anadara Arashi and Shinichi Nakano vs Joel Deaton and Tatsuo Nakano, Takashi Ishikawa and Kishin Kawabata of the Ishikawa Ika group against Osamu Tashi Akari and Jun Kikuchi and Tomohiro Ishii, and debuting Shuichi Ichinomiya and a partner to be named against Masaki Mochizuki and Takashi Okamura and Yoshikazu Taro. Ichinomiya is a former sumo, as are a lot of the War recruits, since Tenryu goes back to his own background like many heads of companies do. Miki Ibaragi restarted the Wings promotion for the third or fourth time, with the first show back on June 26 in Narita. He was supposed to have the Japanese debut of Tsubasa and Arasu, two young Japanese wrestlers trained in Japan by Ultimo Dragon, but they didn't come, and the only Japanese wrestlers he has is Takashi Okano of Big Japan, under a hood as Winger, which was his original identity in Japan. Also on the tour, Mexican wrestlers La Parquita, Espectrito, Mr. Harvest, Mosco de la Merced, Venom, Maniaco, and Heavy Metal. The debut show drew about 250, but by the second night of the tour they were down to around 50 fans. Hiromichi Fuyuki's attempts to draw attention and crowds with the man vs. woman thing will include a July 8 Korakuen Hall match where Fuyuki and Geto and Jado will defend their World Street Fight 6-man titles against Linus Asuka and Shark Tsuchiya and a mystery partner. The combined FMW, JD and LLPW 6-woman tournament had the brackets announced, starting July 27 at Korakuen Hall and finishing on August 15. Teams announced were the FMW Babyface team, with the only member announced being Kaori Nakayama, FMW Heels Crusher Matamari and Miss Mongol and Soryo Kino, LLPW team of Shinobu Kondori and Mizuki Endo and Harley Saito, independent team of Asuka and Tsuchiya and Eagle Sawai, JD team of Chikako Shiratori and Yuki Lee and Sachi Abe, Michiko Nagashima LLPW, and Bloody Phoenix, JD, and Ryura, JD, and two other LLPW teams Rumi Kazama and Norio Tadano and Michiko Omukai and Yasha Kurenai and Carol Midori and Mikiko Futagami. JWP is running a show on July 6 with its match by a swimming pool gimmick. They're doing an 8-woman match where the bout continues until someone is thrown into the pool. Ryushi Yanagisawa of Pancrase will have his first pro kickboxing match on July 25 at Korakuen Hall against Edward Sarston from the United States. USWA The Jerry Lawler-Brian Christopher soap opera continued this week. Lawler had promised to answer the question on television on June 28, but instead when he came out said that pro wrestling was better when it had a little mystique to it, and said that it was nobody's business and he wouldn't answer it. Christopher kept acting like he wanted to answer it, but Lawler would stop him, and then they made it clear to everyone that it was like Lawler acting like his father, telling him he couldn't answer the question. Several of the recently fired wrestlers such as Stephen Dunn, Mabel and Reggie B. Fine, no longer King Reginald, were brought back. Fine is managing Mabel. The next Memphis show was moved to July 13 in order to have available usage of some ECW wrestlers on the show, although exactly which wrestlers are coming hasn't been determined. Paul Heyman taped some promotional material, and it's likely that Rob Van Dam, Tommy Dreamer and Chris Condito will be going. Lawler challenged anyone from ECW to come to Memphis on that show, and also Dunn and Paul Diamond challenged any ECW tag team to come in. They'll also have a Royal Rumble Battle Royal on the show. There's a lot of talk that this group is going to shortly wind up being a WWF satellite company, particularly since Tom Pritchard is moving to Memphis to head the WWF training program, which will include working this promotion. Currently the group is being funded by a guy from Cleveland who runs a chain of massage parlors. A correction from last week. Luther Biggs isn't Larry Burton. Christine Jarrett, Jerry's mother, was fired by the promotion. She's worked the box office in Louisville literally since the beginning of time. That fed all kinds of rumors that Jerry Jarrett would come back to run opposition, but Jarrett really doesn't follow wrestling very closely anymore, and has his own land development business to run. PJ Walker, Aldo Montoya in WWF, is in doing a Conan-type gimmick, including using the 187 as his finisher. Glenn Jacobs is no longer wrestling as Diesel, but instead as Doomsday with a Lord Humongous mask, closer to his Unabomb gimmick, as Big's bodyguard. At one point in the show, Christopher broke a guitar over his head and he didn't sell it.
They ended up doing a stare down with Doomsday and Mabel. For reasons I'm not clear of, Jacobs had been working Louisville as Unabomb but the rest of the cities on the circuit as Diesel. Razor Ramon is still around under that name, but has totally dropped the accent. They did a television angle where Billy Travis was arrested and taken out by police in handcuffs for vandalizing Christopher's truck. Longtime announcer Dave Brown returns to his regular job this week as the weatherman on WMC-TV after being out several weeks. It's the death of both his daughter and granddaughter in a car accident the night before the wedding of another daughter. Here and there. Century Wrestling Alliance ran a show on June 27 outdoors at Harry Delarusso Stadium in Revere, Massachusetts, drawing 952 fans, headlined by a six-man tag team match featuring Sergeant Slaughter. The crowd was roughly the same as what ECW draws in that city. Slaughter and the Mercenary and Jay Jalette beat Pink Assassin and Curtis Slondog and Michael Lano of the Lying Lano Brothers tag team, while Abdullah the Butcher and Tony Atlas did a double count out, and the only other former national name on the show was Demolition X. Since Disco Inferno is still working indies and not in the WWF and it's now July, it's clear he was telling the truth when he said he wasn't WWF bound and blamed it on a computer-started rumor that he couldn't stop. There's apparently heat between Victor Kruger and the CWA. Kruger now works with Battlers in Japan, which is a work-shoot fighting promotion, and has opened up a gym in Germany to train people for Battlers and said it's not to be mixed up with the show sport I once did. Since CWA is old-school wrestling and tries to market itself as being sport, they may have been involved in getting Humbert Numrich, who has done some UFC-style fighting in Europe and Brazil and kickboxing, and looked none too impressive, to challenge Kruger. The biggest show of the past week in Austria was June 28 in Graz, where Rhino Richards, a Michigan indie wrestler, was brought in to challenge and lose to Franz Schumann for the middleweight title. NHB. More changes in the July 27 UFC pay-per-view show. Carlos Barreto, the Brazilian heavyweight considered by many to be in the top 5 NHB fighters in the world, is now doubtful for the show since Semaphore Entertainment Group is trying to scale back. The cost of bringing a fighter and 2 cornermen in from Brazil runs to about $4,500 just for plane fare, and as you've seen by other decisions, this is a bare-bones situation economically, at least until the pay-per-view climate changes. At this point, the heavyweight tournament will have Mark Kerr, Daniel Babish and Moti Horenstein, and several names are being discussed for the final spot. It looks almost like a cakewalk for Kerr, 3-0 NHB record, but the problem there is that, like Randy Couture on the last show, he won a tournament which means nothing to anyone and didn't get over in doing so since he beat nobody anyone knew in the process. And it isn't building up to any natural match. They'll never match Kerr with Vitor Belfort for fear Kerr may derail Belfort, and Kerr will never fight Mark Coleman since they are both members of Hammer House. No big-name Brazilian will be brought in for the light heavyweights either, however Kevin Jackson has officially signed. The other 2 names penciled in are Yuri Valens, a Russian boxer who likely has little chance, and Joe Moriura, a named jiu-jitsu teacher from Los Angeles who looked unimpressive and losing via decision to Paul Verlins at the UFC in February 1996. It looks likely that Oleg Toktarov will be brought back to UFC for the show in Russia in September as part of a heavyweight tournament. In something of a surprise, Dan Severn was held to a time-limit draw by Jeremy Horn in a shoot match on June 26 in Council Bluff, Iowa for Extreme Challenge, making Severn's shoot record at 12-3-1. The Raw, Real American Wrestlers team swept the field in the qualifications for the U.S. team for the 1997 Greco-Roman World Championships. The team trials were held June 28 in Minneapolis. Couture at 214 pounds took 2 of 3 matches from John Ostendorp, winning the rubber match 4-1. Dan Henderson, who won a tournament in Brazil on June 16, swept Todd Giles 6-0 and 5-0 to win the 180.5-pound weight division, and Matt Lindland, Wi-Fi, 1-0 NHB record, won at 167.5 pounds. Couture and Henderson had already won their weight classes in the Greco-Roman Nationals, which made them number 1 seeds in this tournament. All represent the U.S. in the World Championships from September 8 to September 13 in Poland. ECW. Besides the Cornette angle, it was something of an uneventful show on June 28 before a crowd estimated at 1,400 since 4 new sets of bleachers were added to the arena. Lance Storm pinned Tracy Smothers in the opener. PG-13 scored their first win in ECW, beating Mikey Whipwreck and Spike Dudley when Mikey Whipwreck was pulled under the ring and came up bloody, and as it turned out, coming from under the ring was Jason Knight, who helped PG-13 score the win and will be managing them. Taz kept the TV title, beating John Cronus in the match where both guys got a big ovation afterwards.
Chris Candido pinned former tag team partner Tom Pritchard. Bam Bam Bigelow pinned Pitbull number 2. Dudley's kept the tag titles beating the Gangstas. New Jack did another suicidal dive off the top of the stage to a table but landed short and the table didn't break. New Jack collapsed backstage after the match but wound up being okay. The match was said to have been way too long for these two teams. In the other bout, Balls Mahoney pinned Louis Spicolli. The other weekend house shows were June 27th in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, drawing 700, and a bar show in the afternoon on June 29th in Belmar, New Jersey, which drew 500. In Downingtown they had a four-way dance for the tag titles won by Dudley's, but during the match Perry Saturn came out and did an arm drag and a diamond cutter. The first singles meetings of Sabu vs. Dreamer and Sandman vs. Van Dam ended with Sandman and Van Dam having no finish when Sabu and Dreamer hit the ring. Sabu and Dreamer was said to have been a sloppy match with Sabu going over. Van Dam has tremendous heel heat, but Sabu doesn't unless he's with Van Dam. The second pay-per-view will air on DirecTV for Dish owners, and right now the spots being looked at for the show are Orlando, Florida and Cincinnati. The only matches definite for the card are Lawler vs. Dreamer, Terry Funk defending the ECW belt against Shane Douglas, and Sabu vs. Sandman. Most likely it'll be Taz vs. Chris Candido as well. For the present, there are no plans of using Brian Christopher. He was being considered, but Heyman doesn't want to use someone people would consider as a WWF wrestler with the exception of Lawler. July 19th at ECW Arena for Heat Wave 97 looks to be a six-man with Lawler and Sabu and Van Dam vs. Dreamer and Sandman and a mystery partner, plus Funk defending the title. Taz beat Louis Spicolli twice more over the weekend in less than 30 seconds. It may have been an attempt for Taz to protect his shoulder injury, or more likely was punishment for Spicolli for missing a show a few weeks earlier. Heyman wants all the wrestlers in the ring at 5 p.m. before the shows to practice because he wants to develop guys without the knock that they work hard but are sloppy. A lot of the wrestlers have been good about it and some haven't, and some of the ones that haven't are getting their pushes somewhat frozen. When Rick Rude started on Color, he was hilarious with the double entendres but added nothing to the matches. It appeared that he'd run out of things after only a few weeks, and it's been a few weeks and that prediction seems to be right. He was pretty much awful by last week's television, with Joey Styles active being shocked at what Rude would say on television regarding sexual double entendres getting less believable by the week. WCW. Nitro on June 30th in Las Vegas drew 8,239, 7,251 paying $156,187, which was a few hundred shy of capacity in the arena setting they had. The show opened with a classic late 70s style interview by a heel Ric Flair with two models and a mannequin they dressed like Roddy Piper. Flair was really great, although the two models weren't clued in that well on what was going on. At one point when Gene Okerlund asked if he was really the 60-minute man in reference to Flair, one of the women said more like 30 seconds, thinking Gene meant Piper. It was unintentionally hilarious. Chris Jericho retained the Cruiserweight title, beating Juventud Guerrera after a Super Frankensteiner with a Boston Crab submission in 6:49. Guerrera took a bump on his head and shoulders early that knocked him dizzy. Because of that, he missed 3 spots badly, 2 by slipping off the ropes. Even so, the last few minutes of the match were excellent after starting off well below what you'd expect from these two. Okerlund was interviewing Jericho when Six came out and said that Jericho never beat him, and saying that in Los Angeles Jericho beat nothing until he got to his hotel room that night. The two brawled and they went to a break, and were still brawling when the break was over. As the brawl was breaking up, Alex Wright came out and did an interview, but Okerlund totally killed the interview by not letting Wright say anything but basically blowing him off. Eddie Guerrero pinned Dean Malenko in 4:03 when Eddie rammed Dean into Chavo Guerrero Jr., who was on the apron. Guerrero is great in his new Art Barhill role. Okerlund interviewed Rey Mysterio Jr., who challenged Kevin Nash, who accepted the challenge for later in the show. Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff came out for an interview with Hogan talking about the 6-man main event later in the show. Bischoff came out on a motorcycle. Didn't we just see that last week on Raw? Steve Regal kept the TV title, beating Hector Garza with the Regal stretch in 3:36. Fans chanted USA during the match, which was actually the funniest thing on the show. The idea here is to have these two work a program so Regal can teach Garza the American style. Garza is great at what he knows, but since American fans don't understand it, they have to teach the guys to adapt, which is why I'd expect you'll see the real good workers like Eddie Guerrero, Regal and Malenko working with the Mexicans in the future. Okerlund interviewed the Steiners, who challenged Nash and Hall. The entire NWO came out and Hall gave the Steiners a contract to sign saying it was for a tag title match, It turned out to be a contract for a match at the pay-per-view against Great Muta and Masahiro Chono, and if they win, which they will, then they'll meet Hall and Nash in August. Psicosis pinned Super Kalo in 241 due to interference from Sonny Ono. Very disappointing as neither man did much and it had no time to build.
After the match, Kalo attacked Psicosis and then La Parka ran in and cracked a chair over Kalo's back. Juventud Guerrera made the save cleaning house. Flair and Chris Benoit and Steve McMichael beat Scott Norton and Marcus Bagwell and Masahiro Chono via DQ in 3:32 when Vincent interfered for the DQ and McMichael clocked Vincent with the briefcase after the match. Parts of it, Bagwell, Benoit and Flair, were good. High Voltage beat Mortis and Wrath when Glacier and Ernest Miller came out and Miller gave Mortis a flying round kick off the ropes to set up Rage, getting the pin in 1:16. Jeff Jarrett used the figure 4, with help from Flair, to beat Conan in 4:12. Then in a Horseman interview, Flair fired Jarrett from the Horseman, which made the previous finish make a lot of sense. Jarrett vowed to put Flair out to pasture, so they are going to work a house show program since Piper isn't working most of the arena dates. Nash destroyed Mysterio Jr. in 1:48 and kept powerbombing him until Conan came out. Conan then ripped up Mysterio Jr.'s knee, which will explain him being out of action for 2 months. Mysterio Jr. went out on a stretcher again. The idea of this was for Nash to come off as the ultimate bully picking on someone so small, but since it was Ray who called him out, the angle didn't make Nash come off like a bully but killed Mysterio Jr. deader than dead. You know, there was a reason that New Japan never booked Satoru Sayama in his prime in singles matches against Hulk Hogan or Andre the Giant, and that's the same reason why Sayama changed pro wrestling as we know it, and Mysterio Jr. really isn't getting over anywhere near what he had the potential for. They ended the show with a brawl with Savage and Hall and Nash versus Luger and Giant and Page.
It was going nowhere until finally Hogan hit Luger and Giant with the title belt. The rest of the NWO came out. Savage gave Page 3 elbows off the top rope. There was a fake sting. This time it was Mortis under the makeup, since the first fake sting is in Japan and the second fake sting, who is Bagwell, was already in the angle in the crowd, but the real sting came from the ceiling for the final brawl. Both Raven, who was shown earlier in the card, and they had Mike Tenay interview him but he said nothing, and Kurt Hennig came out while this was going on and the show went off the air. It was a very weak way to debut Hennig as he made no impact and neither he nor Raven got any crowd reaction. The original plan for Hennig was to be Page's partner on the pay-per-view, turn on Page and wind up with the NWO. The plan was also for Raven to join the NWO and the angle with Conan to also lead to him joining the NWO. Because that would be too much at once, at least some of it will probably go down differently. There were 3 dark matches after the show. Silver King and Guerrera and Garza beat Villano 4 and Parka and Psicosis in a match that was said to have stolen the show live. Jericho beat 6 via DQ to keep the cruiser belt, and Glacier beat Wrath via DQ when Mortis interfered. Guerrero was still shaken up from the match with Jericho and did almost nothing in the 6-man. Don Fry and Brian Johnson of UFC were backstage at the show. Michael Moorer, a heavyweight boxing title claimant, was in the front row but never shown on television. Mike Tyson came to the building in the afternoon. Tyson was originally supposed to be the big surprise, but the decisions were made all around that it was in everyone's best interest for him to not be around, particularly at the show from Las Vegas. In fact, the MGM Grand Garden Arena and TNT were so concerned about the Tyson aftermath that the wrestlers were told not to use the phrase "bite me" during the show, that Moorer wasn't to be shown on camera because all of boxing is in disrepute this week, and that the announcers were told never to mention the Tyson fight during the show. Ratings for Nitro were a 3.30, 3.00 first hour, 3.60 seconds hour, with a 5.90 share. Raw did a 2.48 rating, 2.28 first hour, 2.68 seconds hour, with a 4.29 share. Nitro Replay once again broke its old all-time record with a 2.01 rating and a 5.08 share. In the quarter-hour comparisons, Nitro opened with the Flair interview and Jericho Guerrera at 2.7 to Shamrock Helmsley at 2.2. Malenko vs. Guerrero did a 3.1 while LOD vs. Nation of Domination did a 2.2. Hogan interview plus Regal vs. Garza did another 3.1 while Putski vs. Christopher did a 2.3. Kalo vs. Psicosis did a 3.1 while Pillman vs. Mankind did a 2.4. WCW's combo of NWO vs. Horseman 6-man and the Mortis and Wrath tag did a 3.2 while the lengthy Paul Bearer interview was a 2.8. Conan vs. Jarrett and Horseman interview did a 3.6 while Owen and Bulldog vs. Headbangers and Headhunters run-in did a 2.6. Nash vs. Mysterio Jr. did a 3.5 while WWF peaked with the Undertaker response interview and Vader Rockabilly at 2.9.
The brawl ending with Sting et al. Peak WCW at 4.1, while Austin vs. Neidhart with the tease the entire match of Bret Hart coming out only did a 2.4. WCW also attempted to bring in Jose Lothario as a surprise for the show, just to get people talking, but it didn't materialize. Other weekend numbers saw main event at 1.0, Saturday night at 1.8 and Pro at 1.3. The wrestler Horseshoe Head and the wrestler Bill Goldberg are different individuals. WCW has let about a dozen wrestlers go. Don't have all the names, but the ones bandied about were Michael Wallstreet, Craig Pittman, Nasty Boys, Jim Duggan, Joe Gomez, Ice Train, and Nancy Sullivan. Nancy Sullivan may make a final appearance in Chris Benoit's corner at the pay-per-view show, or she may be gone completely already. Supposedly Kevin and Nancy are splitting up in real life, although this has nothing to do with the storyline, although they've been pretending for so long when they weren't that it's like the boy who cried wolf when it comes to them talking about splitting up. WCW sold about 2,000 tickets for the July 26 show in Philadelphia on the first day with Dusty Rhodes there. There was basically no line at all for Rhodes autographs as compared with Ric Flair in the same position a few months back. The WCW PR department was furious about the inside article in the Chicago Sun-Times, as were the traditionalists in the office. The reason they had so many problems at the Nitro several weeks back with Sting tugging on the rope and not being lifted is that they had a spot Sting was supposed to be at before he could be lifted so he wouldn't collide with something on the way up, and he was off his marker. They have a Hollywood stunt man who sets these things up for him. Bagwell is starring in a second movie called Return to Savage Beach. Chono and Bobby Heenan had a photo shoot in Los Angeles with Hideo Nomo of the Dodgers. Nomo, who is one of the biggest celebrities in Japan right now, grew up as a wrestling fan, as most everyone of his age group did, watching the likes of Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen feud with the Funks. The other shows of the week were a TV taping on June 24 in Dalton, Georgia, which drew a sellout 1,300 fans, 1,100 paying $7,000, and a house show on June 27 in Fresno that drew 5,113 paying $84,720. At the taping, Buddy Landel was given a tryout match and lost to Bill Goldberg in 90 seconds. They didn't even give Landel enough time to show what he has or doesn't have left. Chad Fortune, who was part of Techno Team 2000 in the WWF, remember them? Got a tryout and put over Joey Maggs. He looked worse than he did in WWF, which takes some skill. Another tryout was for Johnny Attitude, described as a juice to the gills looking Jimmy Backlund, and he put over Hugh Morris, who looked good in doing so. For the show that aired this past weekend, Regal beat Bobby Eaton in a TV title match and Vincent was given a TV win over JL for July 5. Jarrett uses the figure 4 to beat Scotty Riggs in the best match on the taping. Steiners beat La Parka and Damien, although it was Viano 4 who was the one pinned. He did a run-in at the end. Regal beat Psychosis to keep the TV title in a match that had awkward moments, and Harlem Heat beat Public Enemy via DQ when Vincent interfered and attacked Heat, but Vincent was again beaten up and left laying after the match. In a column in the WCW magazine attributed to Bobby Heenan, he claims that Sonny Otto is the most downloaded person on the internet. Entertainment Tonight, MTV and Extra were all backstage doing WCW stories at the Los Angeles show. WWF. As the Raw turns on June 30 in Des Moines, Iowa drew 3,781 paying $69,180. The show was built around the Paul Bearer secret and The Undertaker's response. Most people I've talked with hated the segments, but both interviews did spike the ratings. That doesn't mean people liked it, as people tuned in not because they knew ahead of time they were going to like the segment, but it does show that at least for the week people were intrigued. Bearer claimed that he was an apprentice funeral director for Undertaker's father 20 years ago, and that one day Undertaker and his brother Kane were playing with chemicals and smoking cigarettes behind the house, and that he left for college, and when he came back, the entire funeral home burned to the ground and Undertaker's parents were both killed, and called Undertaker a murderer several times. Undertaker claimed that his father caught him with the chemicals and he got in trouble, but he left to do chores, and when he came home, he saw the house burning down and said it was his brother who did it, but he blamed himself because he was the older brother. He claimed in the middle of the night Bearer took him to see the charred remains of his parents before the funeral. Then as Vader and Rockabilly were in the ring, Undertaker attacked Vader, and then Bearer called him a murderer again. He threatened to kill Bearer unless he told the truth, and Bearer insisted it was the truth because Kane had told him, and then said that Kane was still alive. So I guess now they have to introduce an Undertaker's brother gimmick. Actually, there are lots of storyline stuff from the past that could be taken to make Mankind Undertaker's brother. Always searching for mommy. Uncle Paul. Similar supernatural powers and hatred of Undertaker.
using the fire as a gimmick and wanting to burn Undertaker.
Only problem is the interviews revealing him as Mick Foley from Long Island Kill That One.
Few remember this, but originally when Undertaker debuted in the WWF, his ring name was Kane the Undertaker, but Kane was quickly dropped, so now it's become his brother's name. It came off like a really badly acted high school play. As for the live show, Ken Shamrock beat Hunter Hearst Helmsley in 441 with a belly-to-belly when Mankind distracted Helmsley. It's amazing both how quickly Shamrock is developing into a solid American-style worker and how quickly they're ruining him as an attraction who can draw money because he can work.
Ahmed Johnson did an interview after his knee surgery on June 26, saying he'd be back and after Undertaker and claimed DOA were friends of Undertaker's. Farouk and D. Lo Brown went to the tag tourney finals beating Legion of Doom in 301 of a terrible match when Henry Godwinn interfered and hit Hawk with a bucket.
Afterwards there was a three-way brawl with Nation of Domination, Los Boricuas, Savio Vega, Miguel Perez, Jose Estrada Jr. and a fourth person named Jesus, who I'm not sure of who he is, but he may be Huracan Castillo since Castillo's real name is Jesus Castillo, and DOA. DOA got a big face pop when they came out on their bikes. Boricuas looked bad since nobody wanted to sell for anyone in the brawl and they had the police break it up at the end. Brian Christopher pinned Scott Putski in 337 due to interference from Jerry Lawler.
Real good short match.
Actually both looked way better than in their previous Raw matches. Afterwards Lawler and Christopher beat up Putski and began challenging for Ivan Putski to come, so it looks like they're setting up a father and son feud.
No word what the ECW situation is, but having a tag match could be a backup plan if the Lawler and Van Dam vs Dreamer and Sandman falls apart before summer.
Slam! Brian Pillman beat Mankind via count out in 9:04 of a fairly good match. Way better than their match a few weeks back, ending when Mankind was chasing Helmsley and Chyna to the back. Sable did an interview in a low-cut top revealing yet another boob job. Mark Marrow blocked the cameras acting like an overly jealous boyfriend. Sable needed another boob job like Yokozuna needs more cake and ice cream, so go figure what goes through people's minds.
Owen Hart and Bulldog went to the tournament finals against Nation of Domination, beating Headbangers in 409 when Owen pinned Mosh. Jim Cornette came out with a whistle and out came the Headhunters, who first brawled with Owen and Bulldog and eventually with Headbangers. Hunters looked bad, having a lot of trouble with the WWF loose rings, particularly in doing top rope moves at their weight and in coming off the ropes. The crowd did pop big for their top rope moves. Since they already have a Headbangers team, there is talk Headhunters will be renamed the Arabian Butchers due to their similarity to Abdullah the Butcher. Show ended with Steve Austin over Jim Neidhart via DQ in a bad match since Neidhart looked so bad at 10:30 when Brett interfered.
During the match, Brett, who they pretended was in Calgary and not in the building, attacked Shamrock backstage with a garbage can.
Hey, didn't they tell us that happened last week? Brett used the figure 4 around the post on Austin until Mankind made the save using the mandible claw. Pillman and Owen attacked Mankind with chair shots as the show went off the air. In Shotgun and Dark matches, Rockabilly beat debuting Patriot Del Wilkes with a DDT.
Patriot's work was good, but he did a lot of All Japan style blocking spots that require a lot higher level of sophistication from fans than he's going to get in this country. The spots didn't register. Sean Morley, who is the CMLL heavyweight champion as Steel, got a tryout and lost to Henry Godwinn.
Actually, they didn't let Morley do much in this match. Putski and Truth Commission were given wins for Shotgun.
Blackjacks beat Miguel and Jesus via DQ when Vega interfered, and Vega later beat Flash Funk, which ended with a DOA vs Los Boricuas brawl. In a dark match, the Hart Foundation lost to Shamrock and Goldust in LOD and Austin when Austin pinned Owen with a stunner, and Undertaker quickly pinned Vader. It is a definite that Undertaker vs Vader will replace Undertaker vs Johnson at the Calgary pay-per-view on July 6. At press time, it was only a 4-match show, although that could change, with a 10-man, Helmsley vs Mankind and Great Sasuke vs Taka Michinoku. Godwin's vs Blackjacks is scheduled for the free-for-all match, and Tiger Ali Singh vs Salvatore Sincere opens the show. They had about 6,500 tickets sold as of early in the week. Johnson is expected back in about 4 to 6 weeks. Sid was hospitalized this past week with major back problems stemming from the auto accident, and he's still in a lot of pain and no word now on when he'll return. He was in the hospital from June 24 through June 26 and has pain shooting through both legs.
Doug Furness was supposed to get word this week whether or not he'll need back surgery to repair the broken vertebrae from the auto accident.
If he doesn't need the surgery, he may be back in the ring within a month, but if he does, it'll be several months.
Rocky Maivia is expected back from his knee injury in early August.
Leif Cassidy is also on the injured list, getting a leg injury working an indie show in Ottawa, ONT on June 14. Cassidy was scheduled to wrestle Shamrock on the June 23 Raw in Detroit to tie in Severn being there, since Cassidy was Severn's corner person in Severn's first UFC tournament. For those asking about Ahim Albrecht, he's also in Calgary training with Bret Hart and Leo Burke.
Paul Heyman was listed on the format sheet as the new co-host of Shotgun Saturday Night, which is why they did the angle firing Pillman from the show. However, Heyman claimed he didn't even know about it and that WWF had sent him a ticket to Des Moines for a surprise, but he has no interest in hosting the show. Don't know who the new co-host will turn out to be. Heyman and Vince McMahon had a meeting on June 27.
Word has it McMahon was furious at Heyman for bringing up Eric Bischoff's name on Raw and mentioning Nitro, but Heyman said McMahon never brought either subject up at the meeting, but said the relationship between the two groups could be hitting the rocks, and said there was a lot of heat between McMahon and Van Dam over the finish the previous week.
Some WWF wrestlers are also hot about the double standard on their own show when it comes to ECW. The feeling is that almost anyone, if they're allowed to break tables, could get over, but the WWF guys aren't allowed to do it, and Sabu is allowed to brawl and Van Dam allowed to do topes into the guardrail, which WWF guys aren't allowed to do, and it got both of them over at a time when so many WWF wrestlers are having a hard time getting over.
Goldust and Marlena taped a Crook and Chase episode. Isn't it amazing that washed-up boxer Thomas Hearns is actually 2 years younger than Bret Hart? The only thing new on the Shawn Michaels front is that they've yet to have a meeting between the two sides, but there is one scheduled on July 3. The deal Dan Severn was offered was $500 per television appearance, $1,000 per house show appearance, and $5,000 per pay-per-view appearance.
No word on whether or not he'll accept the deal.
Besides Los Angeles, the other weekend house shows were June 27 in Salt Lake City doing $3,862 and $70,790, and June 29 in Denver, which did $4,873 and $88,317. Those cards were the same basic lineups and results as the previous weekend. Livewire did a 1.1 rating and Superstars did a 1.4 rating over the weekend. Raw tapings for August are August 4 in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, August 11 in Biloxi, Mississippi, August 18 in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and there are no tapings August 25 due to the U.S. Open tennis tournament preempting the show. The Reader's Pages. WWF.
The Bret Owen Pillman Bulldog combination might be the best group of heels since the Flair Arn Tully Wyndham Horsemen.
They've made the WWF something it hasn't been in years: interesting.
On the other hand, the WWF's lack of depth has made the rest of its television positively boring.
As soon as I see Ahmed Johnson, Rocky Maivia, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, or Crush on, I know it's time to switch the channel. Even if they weren't shitty workers, I could deal with them if they had a decent personality. It's time to create a plan to add young talent. Stick a fork in the LOD. They're done. Ditto Sid. Don't forget the Godwins. Why does Hacksaw Duggan have a job with a major company?
There are other old proven names out there with more ability and charisma than he has.
If WCW was smart, they'd save themselves money and dump Duggan, Bunkhouse Buck, Mike Enos, Meng, but I don't want to be the one to tell him Sherry Wall Street, Scotty Riggs, and everyone managed by Teddy Long.
They could take that money and bring in more quality talent.
But then, who would wrestle on Worldwide? What language does Dusty Rhodes actually speak? Why doesn't Lord Steven Regal get a bigger push? Let me get this straight. Steve Austin puts Brian Pillman's ankle in a chair and comes off the top rope on it and breaks it.
Then he breaks into his house and threatens his family.
Pillman rehabs for months and comes back seeking revenge.
And Pillman's the heel and Austin is the face. Are we in some sort of a bizarre world or just a parallel universe?
Pay-per-view numbers are dropping like stone. Over the same period of time, the number of pay-per-view shows has skyrocketed.
Does anyone see the connection? Can anyone say oversaturation?
More supply than demand. Pay-per-view events are no longer special. There are no more supercards.
They all run into each other with no individual personality.
Maybe decreasing the number of pay-per-view shows will make the buy rates go back up. Russ Kress. Union, New Jersey. I've been a WWF fan since 1986. But I realize it isn't perfect, and once in a while I have to rant about the product I see.
How come there are never any legitimate top heels?
The Hart Foundation and Steve Austin want to play both sides.
I realize that's because they have to sell t-shirts, but come on. The only top heels are Farouk and Vader, and Farouk should be a jobber. My first reaction to hearing the WWF may start a light heavyweight division is that maybe they'd bring back Chris Condito, and now I hope they don't. Condito is my personal favorite wrestler, but I don't get to see him wrestle at all because he's in ECW. But I'd rather hear about him being pushed in ECW than have the privilege of watching him job in the WWF on a weekly basis. How do Helmsley and Maivia get the IC title while Flash Funk, Doug Furnace, Phil Lawson and Al Snow are jobbers on television? And who is Sultan sleeping with? How has he stayed longer than nearly everyone besides Brett and Undertaker, and he keeps getting pushes and new gimmicks and rarely does jobs on TV? I just don't get it. Then they give the headbangers a push. It's incredible. I can't wait for the angle where a masked man shows up on Raw and shoots Jim Ross. How is him wearing a stupid cowboy hat every week worse than wearing a toga once? Why is Papa Shango coming back? Shouldn't they instead bring back Kama and have him put over Ken Shamrock? Or is that apples and oranges trying to compare which gimmick flopped worse? Seriously, they should have Bret Hart on television and say that Shango put a curse on Jim Ross in September, and that's why he acted like he did, and then he put a second curse on them and that's why everyone has forgotten about it. I like continuity in angles. Maybe I'm the only one. Right now the WWF has the world's two best managers under contract, but they do nothing with them except Super Soaker commercials. And what happened to Clarence Mason? He had potential. Is there a pattern forming? Speaking of heels, why isn't Sid one? He nearly killed Jose Lothario and his son, was booed out of the Alamo Dome. His last feud was with Undertaker, but he's still a babyface. Then again, how in hell could anyone in the WWF think Sid would have been better in that champion role than Vader last year? That's mind-boggling. Speaking of horrible workers, I don't blame the WWF for pushing LOD because at least they get heat. There are a lot of other guys in the WWF or good workers and we are supposed to think are super over, but when their entrance music comes on, people go to the concession stands. Why would giving Snow a push be any different than giving one to Owen Hart or Brian Pillman? Snow has color. I think he should go to ECW. Shouldn't Ken Shamrock adopt more of an All Japan or Shinya Hashimoto New Japan style rather than a UWFI style? Wouldn't it be better if he could wrestle nightly and not kill everyone in the process? Steve Williams is another favorite of mine that I'd hate to see in the WWF right now. He'd come in, put Shamrock over, then put over Undertaker and be made to be insignificant, and then they'd try to push him as something special with a babyface turn. I hate that process. It's disrespectful to the workers and the fans as they are supposed to believe that the faces are the only ones who can win at the top level. If they want to feed Shamrock a faceless jobber who can work that style, make it Gary Albright. If the WWF is taking votes on who should be light heavyweight champion, I vote for Rob Van Dam. That is based on seeing him in only one match. He has potential to be a top heel in WWF and ECW simultaneously. And the WWF should have signed Hector Garza. Chris Morris. Pennington, British Columbia. Just an observation after reading page 4 of the June 9th Observer, where Weekly Variety has Vince McMahon whining again about how WCW steals his wrestlers and are trying to put him out of business. Where does Vince McMahon think Vader, Brian Pillman and Steve Austin came from? How about Ron Simmons, Undertaker, Goldust, Hunter Hearst Helmsley and Henry Godwin? Name changes and new gimmicks don't change the facts. Weren't Sid, Jim Ross, Cactus Jack, Legion of Doom and Jim Cornette all in WCW? Quit a list. His hypocrisy of trying to blame WCW for putting him out of business simply shows his ego and short memory. Greg Miller. Hamilton, Ontario. Flair. I'm responding to the Flair bashing that has taken place by you and a few other hotline guys, especially Bruce Mitchell. We all know Flair has been slowing down the past couple of years and there is no doubting that fact. But your comments comparing him to the Hulk Hogan of 10 years ago is ludicrous and unfounded. Compare Hogan's match with Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3 to the Slamboree 6-man tag team match. There is no comparison at all. Hogan vs. Andre was a dud to -2 stars. The match in Charlotte, in my opinion, as well as many other Observer subscribers I talked with, was 3.5 to 4 stars. I was in Charlotte for Slamboree. The emotion was incredible. We all know that Flair is almost godlike in Charlotte. But if you watch all the Nitro and pay-per-view shows of the past year and a half, Flair always receives the biggest pop on the show whether he's wrestling or doing an interview. The highest rated part of Nitro is usually when Flair is doing an interview. Flair wrestled at Slamboree after a 7-month serious injury layoff. Who else at the age of 48 would have come back after a bad injury like that? The only one I can think of is Terry Funk. Flair was in no way 100% for this match, but he still performed well. Who else besides Flair after the age of 45 has been world champion 3 times and US champion once? I do agree that Flair's interviews have been silly of late, But 2 years from now, the only line that anyone will remember from 1997 television will be "I've been world champion more times than you've had pieces of ass."
Hall and Nash's interviews are just copies of Shane Douglas during his run as ECW champ. Saying that Six carried that match is nuts. If Flair was carried in a match every day for the next 10 years, it wouldn't make up for the bums like Dusty Rhodes, Hulk Hogan, Lex Luger, Junkyard Dog and Nikita Koloff that he carried for 25 years. Can you name one guy in America over the age of 45 that is a better worker than Flair right now? Terry Funk is close, and besides him, there is nobody else. We know Flair is not the champion he once was. Even so, he still deserves all the interview time, main events and glory that he can get. There has been nobody that has been shit on more in the last few years by Hogan and Bischoff. The crap he had to endure during that Hogan program still burns Flair fans up. Only a company man as great as Flair would have done all those jobs. All those jobs he did for years for every no-talent bum, and he was still able to come back and be champion. Just remember that there wouldn't even be a WCW today if Flair hadn't agreed to stay in 1988. He carried the NWA on his back during the last half of the 80s, even with bad booking, Dusty's finishes, Hogan's ego. His greatness still shines through. One more point about Nitro. What started the great run that WCW has had over the past 18 months wasn't Hogan, Bischoff, Hall or Nash. It was the Flair Savage program with Elizabeth. Savage is really a great company man. It's too bad Hall, Nash, and Hogan aren't the same. 20 years from now, people will still be talking about Flair's great matches and interviews, and people like Nash, Six and Bischoff will be simple footnotes in wrestling history. Bischoff gets way too much credit. The only thing he's done was that he was able to convince Ted Turner to open up and spend endless amounts of money. I could do everything he's gotten credit for. All he's done is hire everyone he could from WWF, ECW, Mexico and Japan. It's pretty easy to be successful when you have a bottomless checkbook. If he had to use his brains like Vince McMahon has to now, or Jim Cornette used to have to, and make WCW self-supportive and pay for Hogan's salary and stop all the other screwy book fixing and all the help he gets from TNT and TBS, he'd be bankrupt in 6 months. He's in a situation he can't fail in. He's got the best talent in the world, unlimited television exposure, and nobody to answer to except Hogan's ego. How could you possibly fail? People like Nash have had good matches in the past only when Hart and Michaels worked their asses off to carry him. Hall, Nash, Six or Hogan will never have great matches like Flair vs. Sting, Flair vs. Steamboat, Flair vs. Funk or Flair vs. Race. The only exception would be Hall's 2 great matches with Michaels, but they will never have the emotion that Flair Steamboat or Flair Funk had. Flair is the greatest single performer of all time in every aspect of the business. James Ferris. Haleyville, Alabama. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 95009-1228. July 7, 1997.